Airbnb and Booking.com have changed the way the real estate rental market operates. Short-term rent has become a preferred choice for holiday rentals, but long-term rents in European cities is the preferred choice. Here I would like to overview pros and cons of long-term and short-term methods. But before we start, I would just like to emphasize that each of these methods, pros or cons, are the other one's opposite. So let's start with short-term rentals. The key benefit which I want to start with is the ability to use the asset yourself. Many people invest in assets which will be later listed in Airbnb for the benefit of using it, even just 3 weeks a year, and use the other time to rent it. But I guess for people who are buying the asset for the main purpose to use it and just rent it a little bit, the yield and the return will not be that high, considering that you will probably use it more than you will rent it. The other benefit with short-term rentals is that if it's managed correctly and professionally, the investment return should be higher. The other benefit which also comes is that the property gets less worn off. Usually when you rent the apartment on these platforms, the tenants, they are either tourists or business travelers. So if they are tourists, they will spend all the time in the city doing sightseeing, eating in restaurants, they will not cook, they will not own pets. Same applies for business travelers. They will go to business conferences, meetings. Also, after each stay, you have the possibility to evaluate the premises, meaning that even if there was some minor damage caused, you can fix it straight away without requiring too much of capital. With this, you get another benefit, that there are a lot of different tenants. The tenants that come to stay, they will stay only up to a few months. They already pay before coming, most of the cases, and those platforms have a security deposit, meaning that you will probably never have to evict a tenant, and thus you will never have to deal with the insolvency of the tenant. There are a few things to keep in mind. The trend that is happening in Europe is that a lot of European cities are becoming to regulate the short-term rental market, meaning that the assets that are for rent, they are required licenses. We can see this clearly in Spain. Apartments with short-term rent license in Barcelona, they usually cost around 50 to 100,000 euros more. Another aspect to consider is how will you administrate the asset. The first and the obvious is to administrate it yourself. But this is time-consuming and it requires skill. It makes sense if you are renting the assets for more medium term, meaning that probably the shortest stay is 2 or 3 weeks. The most popular choice is just hiring an administration agency. So you have those all over Europe. They do everything. They clean the apartments, they change bed sheets, they make sure that everything is okay with your apartment. Naturally, this costs. So then the question ends up, which model are you choosing? The first one is the revenue sharing. What it essentially means is that you split the revenue that's coming from your rental income. Usually the split is around 60-40 or 70-30. The other choice that administration companies can offer you is to pay a fixed rent, and then they have the possibility to subrent. Here I would say you should be cautious because the question about liabilities, who's responsible for damages, could get quite complicated. And if you are renting for fixed rent, why just not rent it for long term? The last thing that a lot of inexperienced investors tend to forget is that you need to furnish Airbnb apartments a lot more than you have to do with long-term rentals, meaning that you don't only need to buy the furniture, but you also need to buy dishes, towels, bed sheets, everything. We just overviewed the pros and cons of short-term rentals. Let's dive into long-term. The key benefit of long-term rentals is that it requires a lot less administration in your time compared to short-term rentals. Usually you just rent out the asset, have a tenant or two, collect your payments. If you have a good tenant, you will only have to send out email once a month with the utilities and the rent that the tenant has to pay. The second thing is predictable income. If you have a tenant for long-term rent and if he's good and doesn't cause you too much trouble, you know what your income will be. The last one really depends on where you are located, but it comes down to the benefit of having to furnish the interior less. The tenant brings everything rest. But also with long-term rent, you can also buy not only residential assets, but commercial ones. And in commercial ones, you don't even have to have a kitchen. The tenant comes and brings all the furniture. And if you even go to other alternative classes, such as warehouses, then you don't have to buy anything. And the upkeep of the premises usually is very, very low. So there are mainly three things that you need to keep in mind when investing in long-term rent. So the first one is your tenant. Before renting out, I highly encourage you doing some homework and research about the person or the company that is renting from you, just to make sure that they are solvent and they could pay the rent and they will not cause you problems. The other aspect is to understanding which asset class you want to buy. Meaning, do you want to buy residential housing, commercial premises, or warehouses? It really depends on where you're located. And I think that it will really come down to your time to administrate the properties and specific know-how of each of those asset classes. And the third one also really depends on where you're located, is taxes. So bear in mind that depending on the asset class that you buy, you may have different tax implications. And also when you're renting out, in a lot of countries, you can ask the tenant to pay for the property tax and land tax, meaning that this will decrease your cost compared to short-term rentals and it will increase your return. But no matter which type of investment you choose, I think that everything related to real estate, it comes down to three things, and it's location, location, location. I think that in some areas, long-term rent will not perform at such a level that short-term does, and in some places there makes no sense to do short-term rentals because there's no business traveling or there is no tourists, or simply because there are a lot of hotels and the price that you offer will not be that price competitive. At InRento, we offer both short-term and long-term investments into rental property. Visit InRento.com today and discover new investment opportunities.